Hi, I'm Bob Gimlin, and today I have a very special video for you. I've been struggling with this video for literally years, but at this point, I've decided that anything is better than nothing. So I'm just going to explain all of this to you as if I'm trying to explain it to an old friend. All the way back in 2018, I received some very titillating emails from a witness to Bigfoot, which is an understatement. He's a lot more than just a witness. And quite frankly, I stopped reading the emails because if any part whatsoever of it was true, I wanted to hear about it for myself. I needed to, I guess you could say. So I made my way to Michigan to speak to the witness firsthand. This was the end of February going into March of 2019. His name is Randy, and he now has his own channel, and he is the founder of Midwest Bigfoot Research, and I'll certainly put a link in the video description, and I'll pin his comment, should he decide to make one. The story you're going to hear is uncomfortable, and it's disturbing. In a lot of ways, it's too much. But one thing I'm completely certain of, well, as certain as anyone can be about anything, I guess, is that Randy isn't lying. There's no doubt about that in my mind. This is his truth, leaving two possibilities. He's crazy, or this happened. Gosh, I kinda hope he's crazy. But I don't think he is. Anyway. All the illustrations you're going to see in this video are drawn by Randy himself to cement this experience and use it to better understand these creatures and the nature of their existence. The events occurred in 1977 when he was 10 years old. Okay, here it goes. It began innocuously enough. With a bike ride, Randy and his friend wanted to bike to the woods to play. It was August, and school would be starting soon, so they wanted to utilize what little freedom they had left. In the woods by Morse Lake, he found this strange network of bushes. They were hollowed out, and some of them were tall enough that he and his friend could almost stand up. This tunneling bush had a central room, and he found old tattered blankets and all sorts of shiny things attached to the walls, and pictures. And perhaps chillingly, Randy noticed that the pictures were the kind that come in picture frames, like the stock pictures to make the frame look appealing to buy. As 10-year-olds, they thought it was cool and didn't think too much of it, and they continued on with their day. Then they came upon two other boys, Russell and Mike. So now it's Randy, Randy's friend, and Mike and Russell. Russell was a few years older than the other three. Mike and Russell were camping there for the night, and Randy and his friend decided to join them. So they went home and got some sleeping bags and a tent, and came back. But the sun had set, and it had gotten dark by the time they arrived. And they couldn't find Russell or Mike. So it's dark, and they can't find their friends. So they decide to set up a little camp with their sleeping bags. About an hour later, after they had just gotten situated, they heard Russell, the older boy from before, yelling for his friend Mike. Over and over again, Mike, Mike, Mike. This drawing is not what Randy saw. Rather, it's the reason that he heard Russell shouting for his friend. Then they started to hear other things, growls and screams. And according to Randy, these noises could not have been the result of any human. They were so frightened by the growls and screams that they got on their bikes and left. Randy told his parents what happened, and they laughed. His dad said he knew the boys would chicken out. The next morning, they set out to get their tents and sleeping bags, which they had abandoned, and this is what they found there. Russell was talking to Channel 13 News, and they weren't allowed into the vicinity where they had left their stuff. It seems that Mike had gone missing. He would be found 24 hours later, and he would never speak about what happened to him in those woods. However, it was blamed on a recently hired school bus driver. Randy did not put this together until much later, but a few days after this incident, he believes that he and some friends had spent an afternoon chasing a dog that wasn't a dog. According to Randy, these creatures are just as comfortable on four legs as they are on two, especially when they're younger. About a week later, one of Randy's friends, a boy named Tim who lived a mile away, which was the closest house to where Randy lived, abruptly stopped socializing. And Randy thought this was strange, so one day at school, Randy asked Tim why he hasn't been around, and Tim said he'd been busy with his pet orangutan. And Randy thought, well, Tim's gone crazy. So on a weekend, Randy walks to Tim's house to see if Tim wants to play. Tim wasn't there, but the babysitter said that Tim was in the cornfield, quote, playing with a troll.
And the babysitter said he was playing with a troll.
The babysitter thought it was a troll?
Yeah, the babysitter said it was a troll-like looking thing. And
in the cornfield.
In the cornfield.
That's 50 feet away from the house.
Yeah.
So Randy went out back, and he found Tim sitting right beside the cornfield, with all of his toys scattered around. Randy didn't expect to see anything, of course, until he did. and I guess this is what he saw. Tim informed Randy that the creature's name is Mike, and that he can say his name. Now, in hindsight, Randy believes that he learned the word after the incident where people were shouting for the human Mike in the woods all night. Tim informed Randy that the orangutan doesn't like clothes. After regarding Randy skeptically for a good amount of time, Mike the Sasquatch emerged from the cornfield and grabbed Tim's arm, as if trying to take him into the cornfield. Tim was not alarmed by this. Rather, he playfully said, "Knock it off, what are you doing, Mike?" And Randy learned that Mike indeed could say his name, the name Mike. Though according to Randy, it sounded much like a burp. Now it's important to remember that at this point, the two 10-year-olds very much believed that this was an orangutan, and they played with Mike for hours. Sometimes Mike would retreat into the cornfield, and he would mimic the boys. Mike also liked to say his name, Mike, because apparently Randy and Tim found it funny and would laugh, which the creature seemed to enjoy. Then Tim and Randy went inside for lunch, and Randy went home. That night, Only Bionic Woman was on TV, and Randy didn't want to watch it, so he went out to several barns on his property to play, as he often did. He was in the hayloft for a few minutes when he heard the door open. He thought it was his dad coming to talk to him about something, but it wasn't. It was Mike, the orangutan. And after regarding Mike hesitantly for a while, they began to play. And the first thing they did was press their feet together, and Randy marveled at what flexible feet orangutan have. This is one of the reasons he was so convinced that Mike was an escaped pet, because he was so calm, indicating, of course, that he was accustomed to interacting with people. Randy told me that when he was a kid, he had a penchant for making noises. So if he heard a noise, he would repeat it, as a lot of kids do. And that led to their next activity. Randy would make a noise, and Mike would parrot it, but not only repeat it, he would elaborate on it, and make it impossibly accurate. One time I asked Randy what the Sasquatch sound like. He said however they want to. Randy would meow, and Mike would repeat the same sound. Only Mike's meow was indistinguishable from a cat, and the creature would elaborate on the sound, making it obvious that he understood what the sound was. So as an example, Randy would meow, and then Mike would meow, mew, and hiss. So he wasn't just mimicking. It's as if Mike recognized, that's a cat, this is what cats say. And it was during one of these cat mimics that Mike hissed, at which point Randy describes Mike's face appear as though it was melting or bubbling. Randy now attributes this to infrasound, which is known to have a wide array of effects on whoever hears it, and is also known to be produced by other large mammals. There were ropes coming from the ceiling, and Mike the orangutan and Randy played with them. And this is when Randy got a really good indication of this creature's athleticism and strength. Randy said it was alarming to see how strong he was. So, playing excitedly, as kids do, Randy decided to beat his chest and make an ape noise, like he'd seen in movies. And Mike repeated it, and his eyes turned red, and his demeanor became aggressive, and Randy thought he was about to die. And it was during this aggressive display that Randy learned that these creatures have an anatomical feature that I've never heard of before. He described them as tusk-like teeth that elongate from the molars, and they do so consistent with the mouth opening. So it's like involuntary. As the mouth opens, they protrude, and as the mouth closes, they retract. Well, poor little Randy no longer thought this was an orangutan, or at least, not a friendly orangutan, and he went to flee, but Mike wouldn't let him. Again, looking back, Randy thinks that Mike was still only playing. Like the mimicking game, where Mike always took it one step further, so Randy beat his chest, which apparently is an act of aggression to these creatures, which Mike repeated, taking it one step further. It's unclear whether or not Randy was actually in danger, and though Randy thinks that Mike was only playing at aggression, that still doesn't mean that it's not dangerous, because normal actions to this creature could certainly prove deadly to a human, which has obviously been documented in other large primates. Much like Harambe, if you remember that. I don't think the gorilla was trying to hurt that kid. It's just that humans are less physically capable than a gorilla analog of the same size. And so in hindsight, Randy thinks that Mike was only play fighting. He didn't realize that at the time. And Randy started to scream for his life, at which point Mike pounced on Randy and made a strange hissing sound that Randy claims had a paralyzing effect. At close range, Randy was completely unable to move. Not because he was pinned, but because of this sound. And Randy claims that the sound produced not only prevented him from moving, but actually significantly calmed him down. Again, in hindsight, Randy now believes this to be infrasound. Then Randy hears the hay door open, and he thought his dad heard his screams and was coming to his aid. He can't actually turn his head to look, of course, but Mike reacted and hopped off him, at which point Randy observed that it was actually Mike's mother, and she was angry. Again, in hindsight, Randy believes she was shocked to see her son fraternizing with a human, and the father was just outside the barn. So Randy now believes that Mike was using his infrasound to try to silence him, because Mike didn't want to attract the attention of his parents, as if Mike knew he was engaging in a forbidden behavior. The female Sasquatch kind of lifted herself into the hayloft, grabbed Randy, and smelled him, with very fast sniffs the way a dog does. And he said that the Sasquatch picked him up rather roughly to do this, and in the process, the Sasquatch picked him up by the waist and brought him to her nose, so like she wedged her thumb between him and the waistline of his pants, and I guess that immediately broke his pants off. So now he's as he was the day he was born. And then she kind of discarded him, or just dropped him, which, I guess lacerated his thigh. And there's more illustrations of this on Patreon, but I don't think I should show it here. And he didn't draw anything graphic or anything, but still too graphic for here. And it's at this point that Randy saw the male Sasquatch watching from outside. Meanwhile, Randy's father is approaching with a rifle, and Randy depicted it here. The male could see his father, but his father couldn't see it. Randy's father saw from the kitchen window 2 massive hairy figures moving on all fours toward the barn where Randy was playing, so you could see why he would have taken off with protection. At the time, he thought they were bears. The female grabbed Mike and leapt from the loft, but Mike was still holding Randy, so Randy tumbled with them. Again, Randy thinks this is an example of the difference of the physicality between Sasquatch and humans. As a 10-year-old human boy, that was an extremely dangerous fall, but from knowing what he knows now about Sasquatch, he thinks that that would have just been normal, rough and tumble type behavior. Randy's dad appears, and he's cursing and exclaiming in shock. He can't believe what he's seeing. As the adult Sasquatch are retreating into the cornfield, Mike is still being held by his mother, and he's struggling furiously. He somehow escapes her grip, and approaches Randy and his father on all fours. The adult Sasquatch don't pursue the juvenile, but they growl. Mike stands up a mere 10 feet from the humans, and Randy, who's still in a state of horror, yells for his dad to shoot it, which is kind of understandable at this point. His dad fires into the air because he had a 16-gauge shotgun, which was loaded for birds. He knew it probably could have ended Mike, but certainly not the adults. And being a father himself, it was clear that an attack on Mike would not have been appreciated by the massive creatures before him. At that point, all 3 Sasquatch disappeared into the cornfield. But Mike came out a moment later. Mike's parents apparently thought that Mike was fleeing with them, but he wasn't. With Mike approaching and the 2 parents nowhere to be seen, Randy and his father fled into the barn, because they still don't want to shoot, obviously, and incur the wrath of the 2 giant creatures. But there was a gap in some of the boards of the barn, and Mike once more tried to get a hold of Randy through that gap, at which point Randy's dad hit Mike's arm with the butt of the shotgun, and then Mike grabbed the shotgun, and they played tug-of-war with the Sasquatch.
But Mike grabbed that gun, and he almost got it away from my dad, and he shot. Well, he couldn't get the gun away from him. My dad had his leg up on the freaking side of the barn. He's trying to go like, oh, he's strong. He's going like that. And he finally shot, and that scared him away, and it got quiet again.
And see, this is why it's kind of important to remember that Randy and Mike had been playing for a long time before things escalated. So Mike was likely still in play mode. Because if you think about it, if 10-year-old Randy and the Sasquatch are the same size, Mike probably has the comparative mentality of a 5 or 6-year-old human. Maturity-wise, I mean. And if you've ever dealt with kids of that age, then you know how smoothly ending playtime goes. Randy's father fired the gun, and Mike let go, and immediately after, they heard sirens. It seems Randy's mother had called the police. She didn't even know that Randy's father had gone out to the barn, but I guess from the window of the house, she saw 2 large animals and couldn't find Randy or her husband, so she believed there was a bear attack occurring and called the police. A squad car and an ambulance arrived. Randy and his father exited the barn, and the responders actually cut Mike off as he tried to enter the barn through a gaping hole in the front. And the policeman asked if there were 2 bears, as dispatch had told them, at which point Randy's father informed them that it wasn't a bear. While Randy is being put into the ambulance, requiring a few stitches at where the female had lacerated his thigh, Mike was crawling through the tall grass in a state of agitation. The police officer could see the movement through the grass, but the grass was too tall to make him out clearly because Mike was on all fours. And then 20 feet from the ambulance, Mike stood up. Randy is hearing this from inside the ambulance, but all of a sudden he heard the police swear and fire their weapons. Randy is unsure if they were trying to hit it or just scaring it off, because Randy's father is begging the police not to shoot it, because he assumes the adults are still watching. And to me, this indicates the unfathomable nature and physicality of the creatures he witnessed. There aren't many animals in the world today that would be too threatening to two men armed the way they were, short of giant herbivores and lions and tigers and the largest of bears. And then all was quiet, and Randy received stitches in the back of the ambulance while his dad talked to the police. Then they hear gunfire from the direction of Tim's house, and the policeman's radio begins to chatter to that effect, so the police take off a mile down the road, and Randy and his dad soon follow. When Randy arrived at Tim's house, they found the police inside, talking to Tim's dad, and Tim's mother and siblings were packing up the car. They were preparing to leave, which they did, forever. Randy found Tim in the cornfield, and he was crying. Tim told Randy that his father had shot the orangutan. It seems Tim's family had been relaxing after dinner when they abruptly heard screams and banging on the side of the house. Tim's dad got his gun as Mike came in through the bathroom window and went straight for Tim. Simultaneously, Tim's family began to scream as they see Mike's parents leering in through the window. Tim begged for his dad not to shoot, but Dad, understandably, didn't listen, and Mike gets shot in the living room, and he retreats the way he came. Randy drew this using a combination of Tim's retelling and simply by seeing the house afterwards. It was probably easy to piece together. Randy thinks that at this point, Mike doesn't realize what the guns do. He thinks they just make noise because there'd been so many gunshots and nothing had happened. And for the record, even Tim's parents thought that Mike was an orangutan, until they saw the adults watching through the window. I guess this was one of those instances where your kid's imaginary friend abruptly becomes less than imaginary. A search by law enforcement fails to find Mike that night. However, Mike's injuries were grievous, and the people who lived next to Tim's house, so 2 houses down from Randy, found Mike's body in a creek the next morning. Randy and his dad came over, and Tim and his dad were already there with the property owner. Mike was lifeless and rigid, laid out on a picnic table, in sharp contrast to how he'd always been. And by the time Randy arrived, it seems that an impromptu autopsy was being conducted by the property owner and Tim's dad. Both men were hunters, and both were accustomed to cutting, and I guess they wanted to figure out what this thing was. Once Randy realized what they were doing, he threw up in the cornfield, and he wouldn't watch, but he heard the 2 men's discussion. They described the hind tusks, which rapidly unsheath as the mouth opens, and strangely enough, 2 hearts, or at least another organ beside the heart that seemed to perform some function related to blood pumping. Randy would later describe this as a detached chamber. They also noticed that Mike's member was inside of him, whatever that means. The kid whose property this took place on took photos of Mike. They were just about finished doing whatever they were doing when Randy saw 2 massive dark shapes peek out from behind a barn. Randy realized what it was before anyone else did, and he ran for the house. The property owner screamed and ran too, and according to Randy, he wet himself. Tim's dad, however, having seen the creatures before, and therefore being slightly less surprised, went for his rifle, at which point the creatures disappeared, and not silently, they crashed away screaming. After that, Mike was buried in a trench that was used for farm animals. Ironically, Randy thinks that it was these graves that attracted the Sasquatch in the first place. Randy told me that a company that sold horse and cow feed to that area of Michigan made a terrible mistake and had sold feed contaminated with a chemical called PBB, a flame retardant. And this is one of the many things that not only surprised me, but surprised me even more to learn that it was very much true. And I guess the effects lingered in the livestock for many years and seeped into multiple products. Some days later, Randy was called to the principal's office. It seems the boy who had taken the pictures had brought some of the photos to school, and Randy was in some of them. Randy said nothing to the principal, and as far as he knew, neither did the other boy. But when Randy got back to his house after school, there were carpet cleaning vans there, and his parents were not. Some men there were from the National Guard, and others weren't. Randy now assumes that they were the infamous Men in Black. though he said they aren't pale, and they're not paranormal. He believes that they're a tribal entity, and that there are a few matters on the continent that they have jurisdiction over, and they avoid oversight because of their tribal affiliation, and therefore are not necessarily part of the government of the U.S. But I suppose there are a few matters that are deferred to them, according to Randy. And it seems that the soldiers had an argument with these alleged men in black on how to proceed, and it quickly escalated, but then cooled down, and it seems the men in black won. After the application of substances, they had Randy lead them to the place of the incident, and though he never told them where Mike was, he couldn't help but look to the grave. The family who owned the property was furious at poor little Randy for leading the authorities there, and they recovered Mike, and he was confiscated, and so were the tools used for the dissection. And according to Randy, all mention of these occurrences, including one newspaper that mentioned human Mike's nocturnal misadventure, were all scrubbed away. Randy isn't really sure what happened next. The memories get a little bit hazy, but through some kind of psychological technique, which I won't elaborate upon, all the youth involved were made to forget about this, to varying degrees of success. But all the adults, according to Randy, were convinced to maintain silence through more traditional means. And then 20 years passed, and it wasn't until the late 1990s, when Randy was in his 30s, that he began to remember this incredible saga. At first, it was only fevered dreams, then with little snapshots during his waking life. And then he began to sketch them, and as he sketched them, they came to life. And of course, these sketches are the illustrations you've been seeing throughout this video. And one of the many most astounding things about this whole case is that Randy was not even slightly artistically inclined until he began to try and draw his memories, and it also helped him piece together the memories and make sense of everything. And it wasn't until this point that he realized that he had any artistic inclination whatsoever. When I met with Randy, I had yet to work with an illustrator myself, so unfortunately, the complexity of that process was kind of lost on me at the time. The sheer volume of detail is truly astounding. If I'd been working with an illustrator and then visited Randy, I would have been far more intrigued by that. So the fact that he went from not drawing at all to being able to draw dozens and dozens of images of this quality, that's either a dedication and singular focus that I can scarcely imagine, or it's something else. And I think that speaks to his dedication, or even desperation, to cement this experience, and use it to better understand these creatures and the nature of their existence, which to Randy are as real as the clouds in the sky. Aside from the obvious parts of this narrative that push the envelope in terms of belief, there was one thing that I found a little bothersome, and that is how much agency the kids have, 10-year-olds camping in the woods overnight, and being brought to such strange and ostensibly dangerous sights. I mentioned this to Randy while we were driving, and he super casually said something like, "Well, you're just a kid yourself, so you wouldn't know. But back then they used to treat kids like people." And I thought that was kind of funny. In the distant past, called the 1970s, a time before kids were treated like Pomeranians with savings accounts. Next Sunday, I'm going to upload a good chunk of the interview, with more of my thoughts and commentary on it at the end. I only included a little bit of the interview in this video for two reasons. First, I think it's good to go into this subtly, and come at the interview with a basic understanding of the events, because you don't want to go into this blind, and get your proverbial socks knocked off like I did. But second, and yes, this is a familiar sob story, but I've been having a tremendous struggle with monetization. Every video I make is a sizable investment of both time and money, so it's devastating whenever one gets deemed unsuitable by the all-seeing eye. Especially after I do the whole private upload shtick to run it through the checks, then it looks good, but a surprise comes later. So between this video and next week's video, I'm really hoping that at least one of the two will remain in good standing. And on that note, next week's video is already up on Patreon, as well as some 100 minutes of raw interview. And I promise you, it's unlike anything you've ever seen or heard, and there's a link for that in the video's description, as well as a link to Randy's channel. I want to mention that I brought my cameras and microphones for field investigations, not for recording interviews. Of course, I didn't expect to have to use my camera in the woods, but I know that had I not brought them, that's obviously when the Bigfoots would decide to have a parade. So my interview with Randy was never really part of the plan. I'm accustomed to Sasquatch sightings lasting maybe 3 seconds, and involving 1 or 2 people, whereas Randy's encounter lasted for weeks and involved many. So the interview initially was just so I could keep track of everything, for my own reference. I probably would have behaved differently had I thought people would see this. In fact, I only really wanted the audio, but the cameras have to be on to catch the audio, so I figured I might as well aim them at us. If it seems like amateur hour, that's because it is. And I feel like I'm repeating myself a lot in this video, so I'm sorry about that, but I think it's important to keep in mind that I had not worked with an illustrator at any capacity at this point. It just boggles my mind how the first illustrations I ever received to accompany a video were not by my direction. It's a bit strange how fate seemed to align that way. Whenever I make a video on a user submission, it's based off an email chain or 1 or 2 chats, and I kind of have the luxury of ignorance, so to speak, meaning I can kind of weave past, or omit, the mundane transitions and little details that accompany being alive. But Randy's story is just so specific. It is so specific. This is a lot of stuff happening really fast. Like how Randy's dad took off to the barn after seeing 2 large animals prowling around where Randy was playing. He didn't take the time to tell his wife why he was leaving because of the urgency presented by the maybe bears. Then as he's coming, the male Bigfoot can see him, but he can't see it. Then the police come because his mom couldn't find her son or husband, so that's why she looked out the window to the barn, which she only did because she couldn't find anyone. I don't know if I'm explaining this right, but that's so much detail for such a small amount of plot. Usually, a report wouldn't include that level of complexity. Normally that would just be, my dad came out, and my mom called the police a minute later. And the fact that he managed to catch all this detail in his illustrations is just beyond me. Like how the foot here is looped in the fence. That's something I probably wouldn't have thought of if I was just describing a scene of a Sasquatch leaping over a fence. And that's just one example. My illustrator, Fred Dunn, is obviously a career artist, and I've been doing this for a while myself. And I think we would have struggled with this a bit. And Randy just plopped it all out, with no experience whatsoever. I don't know. With my channel being what it is, with what I do, I think I'm fairly well poised to assess the retelling of complicated events with the use of illustrations. And the fact that Randy just kind of did this, I don't know. I don't know. It's strange. The fact that he drew his account step by step is absolutely remarkable. Especially with no artistic training or even interest until he decided to do it. And had I already been familiar with that process, I surely would have been more stunned than I already was. Okay, so the big question, did this happen? Well, there is one thing I'm completely certain about, and that is, I don't think Randy is lying. And I may have said this already, but this is his truth. I have no doubt about that. I'm sure Randy thought I was touched in the head, because I'd ask the same question in different forms and at different points of the story over and over again. I could not trip this guy up. He was speaking from memory. This was no performance. I'm sure of this. And even if it was all made up, why on earth would he include all the stuff that no one's actually going to believe? And stuff that he clearly didn't want to talk about? And I'm first to acknowledge that the human brain has a lot of gray area between truth and reality. Any psychologist will tell you that passing a polygraph about an incident is by no means assurance that the incident occurred as stated. And I'm convinced beyond doubt that he's not a liar, but I do acknowledge that it is possible to be honest and wrong. But he sure didn't seem delusional to me. I will say, and sorry Randy if you're watching this, but once when he went to the bathroom, I literally smelled and tasted his drink. There was no alcohol in it. It was some sort of lemonade thing. At one point over my 4 days there, I rudely asked if there was anything a bit stronger than water to drink. Lord, did I need it.
I found the monster.
He said he thought there may be some beer in the garage. There were a few, and they were long expired. And I don't know anyone with a substance issue that has expired beer sitting in the garage fridge that is otherwise impeccably stocked with Aquafina and Lipton's iced tea. And let me tell you, Randy is in good shape. Let's see, if he was 10 in 77, then he was born in 67, meaning in 2019 he was 52. I'm in pretty good shape, or at least I was back then, though not nearly as good as illustrated me, but I was certainly struggling to keep up with him. He just marched on, and it was actually a little strange, to be honest. And we talked about current events and relationships and the weather and all sorts of stuff. And Randy certainly seemed grounded to me. The only reason I tell you all of this is because to me, it's clear that he wasn't lying. He's not a druggo, and he certainly didn't seem crazy. So what's left? And it was Randy's emotion that really did it for me, as far as ruling out lying.
And they had Mike's body on a picnic table back behind their house by a pole barn where they had horses. And 2 of the horses had died of that PPD poisoning that I told you that was going around back then. And he had already dug a shallow grave And it was typical back then, and the state would come pick these poison horses and cows up and put them in a mass grave, which is another reason why I think the Sasquatches were close to my barn, was a dumping site from the farm next door that,
Right.
were putting their cows next to our property where that creek ran behind our house. That's what they told them to do, because that little swamp there, they said, would clean their blood and like all the poisons that were in it before it hit
Right.
the creek. I went down there sometimes and that creek was red with blood where they piled those cows up until they took them. But excuse me a minute. Where was I? Can I take a break here a second?
Yeah, absolutely.
I got a freaking super dry throat. Is it still on?
Yeah,
Yeah, we can take cigarette breaks if you want.
yeah. Let's go take a
Yeah,
cigarette.
because where did I leave off? I'll remember that now. I got over there. Like I've had to like I said, the memories didn't all come piling back. It was bits and pieces in big chunks
Right.
with pieces missing in between. Well, the government was already alerted to these Sasquatches. Like I told you,
Yeah,
I was
you're-
going to get to that at the end when they started talking about it. That they were a problem. Well, and people freak out when think about what that kid had to go through. Getting
Well, you went through it too,
they,
but you weren't taken.
I could, even then, I could have handled it. They didn't have to hypnotize me. I didn't have to. I wouldn't have been traumatic. I knew it was an animal, and that's they do animal things. They don't do human things.
Right.
They don't live by our set of rules. I knew that back then. I could have lived with that. I wouldn't have been traumatized.
Uh-huh.
But getting taken at night, that would be way different. Not knowing what the hell. I saw what it was. I could see it was a primate.
I'm going to be totally honest. If that happened to me last night, if the car broke down and that happened to me last night, I would not recover from it.
Really?
No, I don't think I would recover from that.
I think it would be hard. Not now. Dude, I could talk you out of it. I can, if we had a problem with Sasquatch, I could talk our way out of it if you didn't freak out.
You could talk your way out of it.
They don't go to freak out mode right away.
You could talk your way out of it with it.
Yeah. If you don't freak out and start screaming, because they don't go to panic mode right away. If they're around you, they're checking you out because they're curious or you happen to cross their path.
Yeah.
And if
And it's their home.
they're not going to immediately attack you. They're going to give you the bluff charge, or they're going to throw something at you, or they're going to just make noise and make you go away. Then the last thing they want to do, because they're aware of their own mortality, is get her to get into a confrontation with a human. They know that might
Not end well.
have a gun or
Right. All right, let's take that break.
They're smart enough to figure that out. Of course, the juveniles don't know that. That's why the Michigan Dogman thing is so heard about, because they're juveniles and people see the way they run. You see the way I drew them and the way they move. They look like a werewolf or a dog-like thing, because the way their feet bend like this, in the back, it kind of looks like a dog leg. And they're on their toes like that, and then their foot goes like that. You know what I mean? I drew pictures of it like that up there, but.
Lying is easy, but lying convincingly is actually pretty difficult. And the emotion which Randy speaks with is not something that can be contrived or falsified, especially repetitively. Again, I can't stress this enough. My encounter with Randy really caught me off guard. On the one hand, it's so counterintuitive to my perception of Sasquatch. And yet, after years of thought, I came to accept that the behavior that Randy described of Mike the Sasquatch is very much what I would expect of an adolescent creature of this description, going through what we may call the terrible twos, the need for attention, and the drop of a dime changes of attitude. And all things considered, I think Mike was actually quite well behaved, after factoring in his age and maturity level. I think Mike just wanted to play. And let me tell you, this weighed heavily on my mind during our night investigations. Anyway, check out my Patreon for my full interview with Randy, as well as our walk down Randy's Hall of Memories drawn. Next week's video is also already up there, should you like an early viewing. Anyway, again, please like this video and subscribe for updates. That really helps me a lot. And as always, thanks an awful lot for listening.